I am very excited to introduce Dr. Daniel Siegel, and I'm going to give a brief bio and then extend the floor to you, Dan. So Dr. Siegel is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He's also the executive director of the MindSight Institute, which focuses on the development of MindSight, teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel has published extensively for both the professional and lay audiences. His 5 New York Times bestsellers are Aware, The Science and Practice of Presence and Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human, Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, and 2 books with Tina Payne Bryson, PhD, The Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline, which I've used personally and professionally. His other books include The Developing Mind, The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, MindSight, The Mindful Brain, and The Mindful Therapist. He has also written The Yes Brain and the Power of Showing Up with Tina Payne Bryson, PhD. Dr. Siegel also serves as the founding editor of the Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology, which currently contains over 70 textbooks. If you'd like more information about educational programs and resources, you can visit, I'll put this in the chat, Dr. Dan Siegel's website and the MindSight Institute website. I'll go ahead and do that now. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Siegel. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. It's a real honor to be here with you. And I just want to acknowledge, that Brian King and I were just reflecting on having a history starting in psychiatry in 1984, and then meeting Matt State, also at UCLA in 95. And so this feels like a kind of reunion for me. And I know there are some other wonderful friends online. So it's great to be with you all. I'm sorry we couldn't be in person. And I'm so glad to hear in the LA Times that you in Northern California are now alleviating yourselves from the crises mode. And as you know, here down in Southern California, we're actually getting worse. So it's a pretty terrifying moment. For, I think, humanity, but especially for certain regions here in Los Angeles. So just to honor that there's a lot of suffering happening now. And we in the field of mental health have a huge amount to do, to try to bring resilience to people. That's not the topic for today. I know Alyssa Epple, one of your professors, is on, and she ran a beautiful resilience building program for UC San Francisco staff and alum, and I urge you to take a look at that, and I was honored to be a part of that. Today, what we're going to talk about is really attachment research, and how in the field of child psychiatry, we can see what is the role of understanding the science of relationships and how that might overlap, for example, with the science of how the brain grows and develops in a child, and then in adolescence, and then into adulthood. So I'll just pause and say that, this field that I work in called interpersonal neurobiology is itself a way of taking different disciplines of science. So I know Dr. State, for example, is trained in genetics. So we would look towards the field of biology and the different divisions, including genetics, neuroscience. But we would look at also other fields like psychology, which has the study of attachment, which we'll talk about, which is what I'm trained in doing, studying parent-child relationships and how they affect the development of the child. But also other fields like the field of chemistry and physics and even math, and then going sort of more broad scope, looking at not just psychology, but sociology, linguistics, anthropology. So we call this, what E.O. Wilson named it, a consilient approach, which means, can we build a framework of understanding reality? And in our case, for mental health, what mental health really is by looking at all these different disciplines. And I welcome you to come, read the books or join us in whatever settings, not in person these days, of course, where we bring all these sciences together. So from what we abbreviate IP&B, interpersonal neurobiology, there are a couple of fundamental statements that I want to begin our time together here with, that are a little bit different when Dr. King and I, started in psychiatry, 1984. It was just 4 years after the new DSM-3 was published. And we were so excited about the idea that you could, come up with a classification of the disorders that led to so much suffering in people. And that by naming it, we could then study these divisions in a very useful way and then come up with impactful interventions based on these clear divisions. And when Brian and I were in training then, it was so exciting because the feeling was, well, if we figure out the genome, we'll be able to figure out all these disorders. If we understand the brain, both of which were so new to trying to dive deeply into, we'll figure it all out. And so we want to honor that in part that perspective came from a very important history in the field of both psychiatry as a particular branch of medicine, but also the broader field of mental health, which was that there was a lot of accusation going on in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s that when people were suffering with a condition, let's say autism, that the old teaching was, oh, it's because your mother acted this way or acted that way that you became autistic. And while the professionals saying those things may have had good intentions, the outcome was horrible because, first of all, it was a complete error. Secondly, it created guilt and completely ineffective interventions based on the idea of finger pointing at parents. So that, as an example, combined with other ways in which I remember being in my first psychiatry rotations in the 70s as a medical student, when we were learning to use medications for certain conditions like bipolar disorder, where before that, people with that condition were being treated in psychoanalysis without much positive response. And then serendipitously, lithium was discovered and it was found that you could stabilize mood medications. So when Brian King and I were beginning then, this was an exciting time that we learned more about genes, about the brain, and be able to find the right medications and other kinds of what were called biological interventions. And though I was trained as a biochemist and a biologist, I always wondered whatever happened to the term subjective experience. I was trained on a suicide prevention service in college, and we didn't know much about the brain back then in the middle of the 70s, but we did know that if someone called in a suicidal crisis and you could tune into their subjective experience, that could make the difference between whether they killed themselves or they died. Killed themselves and died, or whether they survived and decided to stay alive. And actually, that was a good example of a linguistic output that got a little disoriented, because I'm going to say something that I've never spoken with my words, but I was asked to write. A dear friend of mine who is very big in the field of mental health, Rich Simon, recently took his life. Most people didn't know that this leader in our field of mental health had bipolar disorder. I was a close friend of his, so I knew. And when he did commit suicide, of course, we know, and I remember when Brian and I learned this from, I think it was, I forgot the professional who came to us, Brian, to talk about this, but that if you talk publicly about suicide, and this is a professional meeting, so I feel more comfortable talking about it, but there's an increase in suicidal acts and committed suicide when you, for example, write about it in the newspaper or, have documentaries about it. So when Rich died and the word got out that it was a suicide, people in the field of mental health were really confused. So his widow asked me to write an article about his bipolar disorder. And what was so powerful in writing that, and it's part of why I got a little disoriented saying when someone was suicidal, is we in the field of mental health do everything we can to bring hope into people's lives, not just because we understand their brain or the genetics, as in Rich's case, his family had a very big history of bipolar disorder, but that the mind is more than just the brain. And the love that Rich received from his friends, from his family, from his colleagues at work, kept him going, kept that hope alive, even though his brain was kindling into this terrible thing, even though he had every kind of biological intervention you can imagine, including ECT. He tried everything. And I say this to you because, for us in the field to just make the mind the equivalent of the brain is a big question mark I want to ask you to think about as we dive into the topic of today, the power of showing up. And for me, when I became a research fellow at UCLA after Brian and I did our child and adolescent training, I went on to get a National Institute of Mental Health research grant to study with Mary Main at UC Berkeley to really look at how is it that parents who tune into their children in terms of focusing on their subjective experience, knowing nothing about the brain, these parents are just open and present for their child. Let's just name that showing up. They show up emotionally for them, meaning that they're able to see what's going on in their inner life, just like when Rich was in so much turmoil, for me as his friend or his wife, his daughter, we would tune into him. That would give him a sense of hope that he was joining. And when kids in attachment have that same experience of joining with a parent, the outcome we could study, now our longest longitudinal study in the field, I say our, meaning attachment researchers, Alan Srofe in the University of Minnesota, has a 45-year longitudinal study, and there's lots of studies all over the world in different cultures. But when you look at that longitudinal study, you can show that the attachment patterns that we'll talk about today have continuing impacts on the way an adult functions. And we're going to use different pieces of evidence to try to make suggestions on likely what's going on in the brain. And if you are particularly interested in this idea of this topic, the power of showing up, and how relationships shape brain development, the third edition of The Developing Mind would be a good place to start. It's 500 pages. There are thousands of references. So it's not like bedtime reading unless you want to use it to go to sleep easily. That's probably a good use of it. But I mean, it's intense reading. It's not like a fun little jaunt through science. It's kind of really intense. So I bring that up for you because I'm going to give you a take-home message if you're a therapist and teaching this to your families that you're working with, or if you're a teacher listening and want to see, well, how do I bring what's called secure attachment into my classroom? Or even if you're, believe it or not, in a romantic relationship, it turns out that relationships of what you can call attachment form, which I'll define in a moment, have very similar patterns that we can look at. So let me just dive into this whole area. So in the field of psychology, there is a branch called developmental psychology. And in that branch of psychology, you have attachment research. And like in any field, there's controversies about everything. And, I've been in debates with all sorts of folks in the field of developmental psychology about the value of attachment research or not. So I don't want to just sell you a bill of goods. There is a controversy. And the main controversy from Jerome Kagan at Harvard, and he and I have had literally public debates about this, is for Kagan, who's considered the father of modern psychology, he believes development is primarily driven by temperament, and that temperament is primarily formed by your genetic composition. So you inherit that. And yet, if you sit with Jerry Kagan, like I was able to do publicly, and just ask him, if a child has one set of genes, and yes, temperament is profoundly important. One of my next books is actually all about temperament as it continues on into adulthood and what we do with that in therapy. Very, very important. And yet, because we have something called Aloe Parenting, and there's a beautiful book called Mothers and Others by Sarah Hrdy, an anthropologist who also studies primates. What you see with primatology is that unlike other primates, we humans have this thing called alloparenting, which has basically what that means is aloe means other, and parenting is someone who takes care of you when you're young. Aloe parenting means that we as a species have the very unusual pattern of taking our baby and handing it off to someone that's not the mother and even not the father, a member of our community. And that process, many researchers believe, shaped our cultural evolution. The way we communicate with each other is what culture is. And cultural evolution in turn has pressures on which aspects of the brain will be favored as the generations continue. So one of the outcomes of this moment, and what I said to Jerry Kagan, was that a child has the ability to have one attachment to one caregiver, caregiver A, let's say the mother, another independent attachment pattern to a second caregiver, let's say the father, and even a third attachment, let's say to a grandmother. They can be independent. So I said to Dr. Kagan, your proposition is these developmental patterns are based on genetics and temperament. He goes, yes. I said, but then how is it possible to have one child have three different kinds of attachment? And this is all public experience. You can actually, this part you can't watch because the recording was turned off. But what he does is he stares at me and looks at me. And I said, aren't you going to respond? And he literally would not speak, because it's basically the definitive scientific finding that attachment is based on experience. And yes, there are especially variants we have on dopamine transmission and other alleles that you have that will determine the intensity of your response, for example, to abuse. So genes are important, their variants are important. This is not an either or, it's nature and nurture, not nature versus nurture. So when you take that broader stance, then you say, okay, well, what are these patterns and what do we know about them? And this is where this topic of showing up is going to come in. And as a child psychiatrist or anyone working with children in the mental health field, this becomes really important because for me, when Brian King and I were done with our training, I was really confused myself because, Brian, I don't remember anyone in Brian and I did 5 years together, anyone in our fields, we did both adult psychiatry and child psychiatry together, ever saying what the mind was, even though the field of psychiatry is the iatry, the caretaker of the psyche, right? So we're not fancy neurologists, we're psychiatrists. And so I was just like puzzled by that. So then when I went from psychiatry to being trained by psychologists in my national NIMH research years, I would ask them, what is the mind? And amazingly, that's the ology of the psyche, right? Psychology. They didn't have a definition of the mind, right? Everybody had descriptions, of course, like feelings and thoughts and memories and stuff like that. But when you came to this word mind, no one had a defining term for it. And I asked 100,000 mental health professionals in the days, you can do this in person, and basically about somewhere between 95 and 98% of licensed mental health professionals all around our planet have never been given a definition of what the mind is. So this was just really funny for me. And this was the beginning of the decade of the brain when I was doing this fellowship. And so when I became the training director in child psychiatry at UCLA, the acting training director, I brought together a bunch of scientists to say, okay, well, we have this thing, the brain, and this is the decade of the brain. Awesome. Now, what is the connection of mind and brain? So the neuroscientists would say, well, that's obvious. They would say the father of modern medicine, right, said this a long time ago, that 2,500 years ago, the mind is simply what the brain does. And William James, the grandfather of modern psychology, he said the same thing in 1890. So what's the big deal, the neuroscientists would say. And I would say, well, I don't know. And the anthropologists would say, well, that's not what we think. We don't think it's the brain. We think it's culture. The mind isn't culture. So I'm going to ask you, how could really well-intended scientists, like anthropologists versus neuroscientists, have such a different approach to what mind is? And could they both be right? So in The Power of Showing Up, what we do is we take a long dive into that question, what is the mind? And we say that the mind is fully embodied, not just in skulls. And it has to do with something that's rarely talked about for some reason that I can't understand. That's probably some reason you can tell me about when we do the Q&A. But energy and information flow is the system of mind that is happening both in the brain, inside the skull, and then streaming throughout the whole skin encased body. And yet, skull nor skin are impermeable boundaries that block energy and information flow from happening now from this body to your body at this very moment. So when I was an attachment researcher in training, a trainee, when I thought about what in the world I was doing, because I was a psychiatrist studying like babies, like what's with that, I realized I was studying the biological process by which energy and information flow from one body was being shared with another body. And that's not how my attachment research colleagues talked. It's not how anyone talked. So I felt very lonely, actually. But you could look at it that way and then say the system of the mind is, in mathematical terms, a complex system, meaning it's open to influences from outside of itself. It's capable of being chaotic. And the third and most important feature is it's nonlinear. And that means that a small input at the initial time has a large and difficult to predict outcome. So if you're in this universe, mathematics says if you're a complex system, you have something called emergent properties. So the take-home message is that I think the mind is emergent aspects of energy and information flow that can explain subjective experience. It can explain, in some ways, consciousness. You'll see that in a book called Aware. It can, obviously, it's about information processing, these three facets that are commonly described. But here's the one I want to talk about. The fourth facet of mind is one of the emergent properties in math of complex systems is called self-organization. And if you define the mind as the following, the embodied and relational process that is an emergent self-organizing process that is regulating energy and information flow, both within the body, including its brain, and within the relationships we have with both other people and with nature, then suddenly you can see in this fourth facet of mind, so the first being subjective experience, second being consciousness, the third being information processing. We're going to focus today on this fourth facet, self-organization, because once you say the mind is a self-organizing, embodied and relational process that's regulating energy and information flow, then you can ask the question as a mental health professional, what is a healthy mind? Because with the other three, you can't really say what's healthy subjective experience. It's okay to feel sad if you're in the middle of a pandemic and terrible things are happening. It makes sense that, in terms of consciousness, you could be narrowing your consciousness sometimes to survive, sometimes broadening it, right? So what's healthy consciousness? You can't really say. Information processing, there's so much information processing. What's healthy, what's not? But with self-organization, it turns out that when a system is optimizing self-organization, it moves in a way that creates essentially harmony with 5 characteristics that, if you rearrange them, spells the word faces. It's flexible, adaptive, coherent, which means resilient over time, energized, and stable. These are math features. And this faces flow, I want to suggest to you, is what mental health is. And if you say, well, what happens if you deviate from that? Well, then you get to chaos on one bank outside of the river of this flow. And the other bank is rigidity. And then if you go back to what Brian and I had, the DSM-3 back in those days, or 3R, or 4, or 4, all these numbers, every time I revise the developing mind, I have over a dozen interns work with me. And I always say, check this out. And you can reinterpret the symptoms of not just, the DSM, but these categorizations of disorder as chaos or rigidity. And so far, every study that my interns and I could find of the brain of individuals with psychiatric disorders, like my poor friend Rich, if you look at people with bipolar disorder, there's impaired what's called integration in the brain, the linking of differentiated parts. And it turns out that in math, if you say, how do I optimize self-organization? The answer is you differentiate and you link. When I read that in this very room, in that corner over there is my home office, I just screamed out so loud, I woke up our son, because I couldn't believe there was something so clear that chaos or rigidity emerge when you block this process. Let's just name it integration. Math doesn't have a name for it. When you differentiate and you link. So the power of showing up takes that finding from this conciliant approach, taking math and neuroscience and all these other fields, and says, can a parent be taught, or a teacher be taught, how to create more integration in the family? And here's the ridiculously simple statement I'm going to make. And it's so simple that I had 18 interns working with me this last time to do the Developing Mind from the second edition to the third edition. I said, you have to help me, because what I'm about to say, I said to them, is too simple. It must be wrong. It can't be this simple. So find one example that proves it's wrong. And they go, didn't you misspeak? Don't you mean proves it's right? And I said, no. Just find me one example that goes against what I'm about to say. So they searched for a year. We worked on this. They couldn't find one example. So I'm going to say it, and I even feel nervous saying it because I'm looking at Brian's handsome face. It's just so simple. I'm just wondering, like this has got to be wrong. So, and I'm a very doubting person, always even doubting my own doubts. So here it goes. Integration in a relationship, which we're going to define very soon, honoring differences, promoting linkages, basically the basis of secure attachment, even though attachment researchers don't talk like that. Integration in a relationship promotes the growth of integration in the brain, in the head. And integration in the brain and the head turns out, and again, we couldn't find any exceptions to this, to be the functional and structural situation of the brain that's correlated with optimal regulation of attention, emotion, mood, thought, morality, behavior, narrative, in terms of reflecting and making sense, insight and empathy. That's it. Integration in relationships leads to integration in the brain, which seems to be the basis of well-being, optimal regulation, self-regulation. So in the power of showing up, what you can do as a mental health professional then is take all of that, whatever that was, 25-minute download of an entire field, and with a 36-hour training program you can do, you have these 70 textbooks you can look at, you can do all these things. Now you got the take-home message. You don't have to do any of that stuff. But if you're going to work now with your patients, and if you're a psychologist, maybe you use the word clients, it's like this. You are an integrator. For evaluation, what you're doing is you're trying to feel when there's chaos or rigidity. Sometimes the person is going to have an innate condition, like my friend Rich, of bipolar disorder. His condition was not from his attachment experiences, and yet, if you looked at his brain, he'd have, as studies have shown, areas that are absolutely not linking differentiated zones to each other. And you also have kids with various forms of non-secure attachment, the extreme of which is studied by Martin Teicher at McLean Hospital at Harvard. And what Marty has shown is that if you had to summarize, I remember going for a walk with him in Australia, the days we could meet in person, I said, Marty, if you had to summarize all of your life's work about kids with developmental trauma, what does that mean? It's the extremes of abuse and neglect. So the extremes of non-secure attachment. But if you look at those extremes, just to start there, what does Marty Teicher find? Impaired integration. And what do we mean by that? So in the brain, that means the corpus callosum does not grow well, linking the differentiated left and right sides of the brain. The hippocampus, which is linking widely separated memory systems to each other, doesn't grow well with developmental trauma, which is abuse and neglect. The prefrontal cortex, which has a way of going from, this region in the cortex, if you take your way oversimplified hand model, but the cortex would be here, and it's linking cortical functioning with limbic functioning, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, with the brainstem down here, and even from lamina 1, layer 1 of the spinal cord coming up here in your wrist, and also represented here, the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, and the social world. And that, if you say, why, how can Dan say all these things? Just read The Developing Mind, and in 500 pages, you'll see every sentence I'm saying, I back up with the scientific peer-reviewed articles to support it. So this is just like a summary statement. I know it may sound goofy, but so here's the amazing thing is that this integrative growth in the child's brain is impaired with abuse and neglect. And yet my friend Rich with bipolar disorder, he wasn't abused and neglected. And still, people, even if the etiology, the cause, is not experience, it seems like integration is still a fundamental impairment with psychiatric disorders. So even though now we're going to talk a lot about showing up and experience, and essentially what we're going to do now is turn to the field of neuroscience, and one branch of the field of neuroscience is the field of neuroplasticity, which is, as you know, is essentially how does the structure and function of the brain get altered by experience. So let's unpack that, because the power of showing up has some take-home messages of how you teach this. But for you as a professional in a department of child and adolescent psychiatry, not just you, but I think any of us in the field of mental health need to be grounded in science. And, you know, I sometimes have parents who have adopted kids, you know, or they're foster parents, and they'll say to me, "Oh, I'm not the biological parent." And I'll say, "Excuse me, what did you just say?" They'll go, "Oh, I'm not the biological parent." I'll say, "You know, experience is biology. So please don't use that phrase and demean yourself like that. Do you mean you're not the birth parent?" They go, "Yeah." I go, "Okay, fine, then say that." Because the experiences you shapes, because of neuroplasticity, the structure and function of your child's brain. And they go, "What?" And I go, "Yeah." And they go, "Well, how does that happen?" So let's unpack it so you can have, you know, what Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. And in your department, you're able to then dive into science so that you can prepare your mind for the clinical chance things that happen, and you're ready to do something. And you can even offer these insights to people. And this is why I ultimately, besides writing, you know, the professional texts, I ultimately turned to writing for parents, because, you know, they don't need to set up an appointment and come see you. They can read it in a book, right? And they can actually benefit from this idea that integration is health. How do I, as a parent, learn to cultivate integration? Every single one of my parenting books, I've written 6, every single one of them, without exception, they're basically taking that one sentence, how does a parent promote integration, and teaches them in practical ways how to do it. Okay, so let's look at neuroplasticity. We say the simple phrase, "Oh, experience shapes the structure of the brain, the function of the brain." Well, I'm going to ask you to think about this for a moment. What is experience? And you could say, "Well, it's things that happen." And I go, "Great. Things that happen." Now, what is a thing that's happening? What does that mean, a thing that's happening? You go, "Well, life." You go, "Okay, great. What is life?" You go, "Well, it's experience." You go, "Okay, we're back to where we started." So let's take a look at that and see if we can find a common ground, right? So here's what I'm going to propose to you, that when the next time you see a patient, next time you see a client, I want you to consider, try it out. You may not like it, you can throw it away, but try it out. Try out the idea that experience means energy flow, period. And when that flow, a subset of it, comes through in a certain formation that it symbolizes something, we call that energy in a formation that symbolizes something information. So speaking with a lot of mathematicians and physicists, I'm always trying to find the consilience there. So the phrase energy and information sounds redundant, but it's important because some physicists think information is the fundamental stuff of the universe. Other physicists believe energy is the fundamental stuff. And both groups think one, like energy leads to information, the other thinks information leads to energy. So to make them both happy, you could just use the phrase energy and information, and they all agree with the idea that things change, and we'll use the word flow. So experience is energy and information flow. And when experience is happening for an individual, like in communication patterns with a parent, an attachment figure, then it actually activates the brain in certain ways called neural firing that you know about. And essentially it goes like this: where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connection grows. So when I was in medical school, we didn't know all that stuff. And David Hubel, who's my teacher in neuroscience, he won the Nobel Prize because he showed that the kind of light, in this case, it was the visual system of kittens, the kind of energy flow that comes into the brain of a young developing being changes the very anatomy of the areas of the brain that receive that input. So that's the Hubel and Wiesel study of the impact of various patterns of light on occipital development, the back of the brain that processes light. So what we know then is that energy information flow doesn't just activate the brain, but as Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize for 10 years later, or 20 years later, the pattern in which that flow happens turns on genes that then lead to protein production and can lead to any number of changes, including growing new neurons, and especially in the hippocampus. Later on, you can strengthen or grow new synapses, the connections among neurons. You can lay down myelin so that the conduction is more coordinated and balanced. And you can even alter what are called epigenetic controls. There's lots of ways where experience, the flow of energy and information, is actually changing the structure and function of the brain. So now you're prepared to say, well, how do I promote integration in experience with parents? And here we're going to now turn to a mnemonic that's pretty simple to remember. And, one of my is an area of attachment. So I work with my attachment academic colleagues. There are areas in how to translate this for, us in therapy or for parents. So the attachment field, this is hard to say this, but can be actually summarized in 4 words. And I've presented this to my attachment colleagues, and they're fine with this because it's absolutely consistent with attachment science across cultures. So here we go. For a child to develop an integrated brain, this is the proposal, and develop as best they can. And of course, they can have a condition, whether it might be autism or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that is not caused by attachment experiences. Still, what you'd want to do is optimize the family experiences to optimize as best you can, even when they have innate conditions that are blocking integration from forming. Even in autism, studies show there's decreased in differentiation in the brain. So as you probably know, there are more neurons in kids with autism, and the brain, for some reason, we don't understand why. Brian, you may be able to talk about this. It seems to stop differentiating. That's the balance that gets off with autism, but it's not at all caused by what attachment does. So we want to support attachment, but never, never, never say that attachment causes innate conditions. And we want to say, no matter what your condition is, you want to try to promote secure attachment through these integrated relationships, meaning you honor differences and promote linkages. So here are the 4 S's. The first is safety. And what safety means is that a child is protected from harm, number 1. And of course, this is the fundamental reason as mammals for 200 million years, we've had attachment, is to protect our offspring. But the second kind of safety that we're talking about, which has a huge impact on our field of mental health, is when an attachment figure is the source of terror. What the field of attachment research has shown is that leads to the most disabling form of attachment pattern or category. We never say the word style because, as Mary Main has taught me, it's not a form of shoe. So it's an attachment pattern. And when the attachment pattern is where the parent is the source of terror, the issue is that it's fright without solution because the brainstem says, get away from the source of terror. That's a very old 300 million year old protective system. But the 200 million year old slightly higher up region says, oh, I'm terrified. I should go to my attachment figure to be protected. And since you have one body and now you have 2 networks, brainstem and higher up, limbic and cortical, that are telling this one body to do 2 different things, the mind fragments, subjective experience of the person fragments. And that we've shown leads to something called dissociation, which is different from psychosis. It has a very different kind of presentation. But unfortunately, kids who have this process called disorganized attachment, who end up having dissociation, have huge problems regulating their emotions. They have trouble focusing their attention, especially under stress. They have a lot of difficulty having relationships that are mutually rewarding. And overall, then, they're the most troubling pattern of attachment, category of attachment, classification of attachment, all those being synonyms. So the first S, safety, is crucially important, and there's no such thing as perfect parenting. So we always want to emphasize working with parents that repair, repair, repair. Since there is no such thing as perfect parenting, the process of repair, as Ed Tronick has beautifully shown, and if you haven't seen his still face experiment, please watch that. You can watch it on YouTube. You know, the process of repair is vital for building resilience. So it doesn't mean you try to scare your kids so you can repair. There will be inevitable ruptures in a connection. So that's the safety S. When safety is not there, it's repaired. Number 2 is seen, S-E-E-N. And what seen is, I remember when Ryan King and I were our first year of training, my first therapy patient was a graduate student, and she, for some reason, got better. And I had no idea why she got better. So I asked her, what happened? Why'd you get better? And she goes, well, you know why I got better. I said, oh, yeah, of course I know, which I didn't. I said, you know, what, in your words, how would you say what happened? She said this. She said, never before in my life, in any of my relationships, have I ever had the experience of feeling felt. And I'm telling you, it just melted me because, and and I can see her right now as you know, our patients always change us. It was such an elegant and eloquent way of describing what this being seen is all about. So that a parent, to see a child, to give that child the experience of feeling felt, means they have to see beneath the surface of behavior, to be interested in and able to sense the subjective emotions and memories, perceptions, point of view, all this inner stuff we would call the subjective experience of mind. They're able to really focus on that. We call that attunement. So the experience for the kid is to feel felt, and instead of being alone, they feel like they are an authentic part of a we without losing the integrity of me. And that is a definition of integration, that when you take differentiated things like a baby and a parent, and then you link them with this compassionate communication of being seen, you don't lose the integrity of the individuality of each member of the whole. And it's what Buckminster Fuller called synergetics, or synergy. The synergy is a scientific term, and he's got a great article in this next book I'm writing that I review his article, just about how that word is so not used enough in science. But it's basically the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's what being seen gives you, the experience that I am a part of something bigger than my bodily defined self. The third S, again, when these don't happen, they're repaired. You know, there's no such thing as perfect parenting, but the third S is being soothed. And what this means is when a child's in a state of distress, then the parents connecting with the child, getting down on their level, opening to what's going on with them. That a dyad is a pair, and that's called dyadic regulation. And the experiences of dyadic regulation seem to be able to grow the regulatory circuits in the child's brain, so that, unlike what some relatives of mine told me when our kids were young, you know, don't take, you know, approach your child when she's crying or he's crying, you're going to spoil them. It's just the opposite. By you tuning into a child when they're suffering and helping reduce the suffering, they actually develop the circuitry of more autonomous regulation. So yes, they can turn to other people and still use relationships to help them. But you've also given them the inner resource of, you know, what's called self-regulation. I don't really like that term, but more autonomous regulation. When you're soothed, then you're learning that I can rely on others. And it's not in an entitled way, and this leads to the fourth S, security. Security is not entitled like, oh, I deserve to take over the world or something. No, security is you feel like your inner life is worthy of being known by someone else. That when you're in distress, you are worthy of connecting with someone else so you can reduce that distress. That you are worthy of showing up, being present for others in relationships. And so that's really what security is. And what Alan Sroufe, S-R-O-U-F-E, at University of Minnesota showed in his 45-year longitudinal study is that when you have security, you basically are given a kind of inoculation. We're now at a time of vaccinations, a kind of vaccination. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it's the best gift that parents can give to help the child achieve mental well-being. So again, I want to remind ourselves that there are many conditions absolutely not caused by attachment that go forward in life and lead to huge amounts of suffering. And I share with you my experience of my friend. And at the same time, what we want to do as people in the field of child psychiatry and the field of child and adolescent mental health, working with families, working with individuals, working with teachers in schools, we want to really help people understand how to promote more integration. The final thing I'll just say is a pitch for us to understand what the pandemic has offered us. You know, I've done a number of talks recently for schools about looking at not just the viral pandemic, but the pandemics, if you will, things that go across humanity, of social injustice and racism, of environmental destruction and the loss of biodiversity. You know, the pandemic in many ways of not just the virus, but how people don't cooperate with each other to try to reduce the spread of the virus. The pandemic of misinformation and polarization that comes from that and that leads to that. So those four pandemics in many ways relate to a fifth pandemic, which is what I'll close with, which is when you take a step back and look at human history, we're at a moment now that I think we in the field of child and adolescent mental health, especially, and more broadly, the field of mental health, have a real invitation to really do some interventions. And here's what I want to leave you with. Modern culture has been shaping human cultural evolution in ways towards what we can simply call a separate solo self. And when you look at the incidence of all sorts of, challenges to mental well-being, like loneliness and isolation and, the distress, the increased suicide, drug addiction, in many ways, these can be seen in part to be caused by social factors that are built on this view of an isolated solo self. So if you said, well, then how can we possibly create integration about identity and belonging? And one way then of saying it is, this is really a summary of our whole time together now, we have a me that lives in a body, for sure, and, not or, and who we are, what the mind is not just embodied, it's fully relational. And when you look at an integrated self, you say, well, okay, I'm a me and I'm also a we. How would I, try to remember that as an integrated identity? And one way you can do that, and we have a fun word, which is me plus we, is mwe, M-W-E. So with the notion of mwe, what we can do with this pandemic is see all the terrible suffering, all the loss of lives and livelihoods as really a window into a moment in human history where the system that was going forward was actually not working well. And it's a huge disruption. And systems need disorganization to enable reorganization into new pathways. And I personally feel that one of the pathways that might really help is to consider that the way we categorize, conceptualize, and even symbolize self as being only in the body is at the root of each of these pandemics. And an integrated self, an integrated identity, a broader belonging may be a way we can actually help the world recover from this viral pandemic and work directly to reduce the suffering of these other pandemics. So let me thank you so much for your attention. There's a lot of work for us to do, and I'm honored to be here with you to be on that journey.
Thank you so much. I've been rendered speechless, and for people who know me, that's actually an unusual state. Let's take some questions. We have about 9 minutes before we have to end. Please feel free to ask your questions over chat or just go ahead. Brian, I see you. Go right ahead.
Great. So I just want to lead off with a thank you, Dan, for sharing your wisdom with us. I think one of the things that I take away from your talk is that integration is not a PowerPoint presentation. That is phenomenal, outside of the box, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So a serious question, though, is that one could take, I think the way that you presented it could lead someone to see almost a unidirectional flow of the energy, that integration in relationships leads to integration in the brain. And I wonder if you could speak to the bidirectional aspects of that. I'm thinking in particular about kids with autism who just are not going to respond in the same way that neurotypical children might to the attachment overtures from their parents and others, and how the two-way street nature of the processes.
Yeah. First of all, Brian, thank you so much for that. And your question is such a beautiful example of, I think, how we need to think in systems terms, the bidirectionality of influence, and not just linear causality. So let's really honor that as we get started on how to approach the question. You know, when I was a research fellow, my wonderful research mentor was our teacher, Marian Sigmund, who recently passed away. And Marian was just so wonderful. But what she taught me was, when you empirically look at, for example, how kids on the spectrum have attachment, it turns out they actually have a typical distribution of attachment categories. They just express their behaviors in atypical ways. And what that raised was the question was that, number one, of course, we knew autism isn't caused by attachment. But the second thing that Marian taught me at that moment and published it, you know, was that attachment, it isn't the attachment system that's disrupted. Kids with autism need attachment. So what you can do then as a therapist is work with, given Marian Sigmund's findings, really work with parents about how to find a way in to have a child be safe, seen, and soothed, you know, the summary of the entire field of attachment, so that they could be secure. And we were able to show that kids with attachment, you know, security actually do better. So that's number one. But the second thing is the bidirectionality of it. You know, we don't say that a parent is attached to a kid. We say they're bonded. And so when there's atypical ways of being, certainly with autism, that'd be one, but also, you know, massive dysregulation, like kids who ultimately end up having bipolar disorder, you know, it's really hard for parents. So you want to let them know you're not causing this, and I'm going to help support you in trying to find a way to have them safe, seen, and soothed. And, you know, sometimes there are interventions that can work. I know at Stanford, there was an attempt, I don't know if the results are in, from Kiki Chan, about having kids who are at risk of bipolar disorder do meditation. I know one attempt of doing that with adults didn't work at UCLA, not with kids, but with adults. So we want to be just open to trying how it's bidirectional, but realize that there are some conditions where the impaired integration in the brain may have real challenges to the relational side of it. Now, that being said, I was once asked to speak at a neurofeedback conference, which I didn't know much about. And I said to them when they asked me, and then I got up on the stage, I said, I don't know much about this, but here's the idea of integration. And they go, well, that's everything we do in neurofeedback. So I know when Denny Cantwell, right before he died, he really was interested. He was our training director in child psychiatry. He was so interested in seeing if neurofeedback could work with ADHD. and he didn't live long enough to know, and I don't know what the outcomes are now, but that would be an interesting thing to say, well, you might have an inborn impairment to integration that was not caused by experience, but it's certainly influencing your relationships and your experience. Can we give you something like neurofeedback or other ways you might integrate the brain that are going to work even though it wasn't caused by experience? So it really opens up the field, our field, to say exactly what you're saying. How do we use either relationships of therapy or interventions like neurofeedback or other interventions that might really increase integrative growth, even though it wasn't caused by experiential etiologies? Yeah, but it's a really good thing. The way to think about it too is, if I have an integrated brain, I'm more likely as a friend to you to have a mutually rewarding friendship that I bring to the table. But when my brain might not be integrated because of my attachment experience or innate features, I'm not going to be able to have that friendship with you. And sadly, and Alan Srough's study shows this beautifully, we evoke from the environment ways that we carry with us from the past. We get, lost in familiar places. So this question is so important, Brian. How do you look at the bidirectionality of all this? It's a great, great question.
I'm seeing a question in the chat. Oh, sorry. I just went off. Okay, I'll proceed. Any thoughts about how to decrease suicidal ideation and suicide in adolescence? This comes from Tony Yang.
Wow. Well, that is such a great question. Thank you. And, I'll say this because, I share with you the story of my friend Rich, and this is something, in anyone we want to see how to prevent it. When Brian and I were in training together, one of my mentors was Ed Schneidman, who started the American Suicide Prevention Service a long time ago. And Ed taught us all, about something called a psych ache, an achy in the mind, in the psyche or the soul, that it wasn't just depression, And so one thing we do know is if you can tune in to a person so they're not alone and they can feel felt, everything we talked about, there's more likelihood that you're going to keep hope alive in their life. Now, sometimes, and I had to write this up in the essay I wrote about my dear friend Rich Simon, even though he tried every intervention known to humanity and it just didn't work for him, and he made a decision, I can't have this much pain in our lives. And Rich would never want people to choose suicide, even though it was a choice he made. It was not an impulse. So you're asking about adolescents who are in the middle of all sorts of things. In the book Brainstorm, I write all about, for adolescents, how to become aware of their inner life and how to deal with it. If the intense emotions during this brain remodeling period of adolescence, if those intense emotions aren't able to be communicated, or the adolescent isn't given the support to know how to ride the waves of that storm, then it can absolutely be flooding. So in the Brainstorm book, I offer interventions to teach adolescents how to become more aware of their inner life, so that in that inner reflection, they're then able to share that with others. Often in adolescence, it's not the parents, but it could be with a therapist, a teacher, their peers. And in terms of what we need to do, I think we have to make sure that we function as a we, that we are responsible for one another. We're responsible as a community for each other. The mind is not just happening inside your head. We live in I work with these colleagues at MIT, Peter Senge and Mette Bol and Otto Scharmer. We use a term called relational fields. We're trying to figure out how to study them, but I'll just say this in terms of suicide. If you are in a relational field where you feel like you belong, your hope will be ignited. The feeling that I am part of something larger than just my skin encased body can keep that sense of I'm not helpless there. And, you see this in people who talk about their experience with addiction, who ultimately, let's say, get into AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or Narcotics Anonymous. And what you see when you hear them talk about that they were suicidal, and now they can see in community a reason to live, I don't think that's an accident. I think those processes found the reality of the relational mind being as fundamental to who we are as the embodied, in skull brain, right? The relational aspect of who we are is, I think, how we have to keep hope alive in this country, in the United States, especially with the pandemic, with all the isolation. There's way too much loneliness. There's way too much feeling of despair because essentially half the mind isn't there. You've cut off the relational aspect of the origin of who we are. And that's something we can do something about.
Sage words. Thank you so much, Dr. Siegel.
And please call me Dan. Otherwise, yes.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you,
Dr.
everyone,
Stewart.
for being here. We should wrap up. I will do quite a bit of thinking the rest of this afternoon. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor to be here with you, Dr. Stewart and Barbara. And I want to thank everyone for all the work you do. I think one thing the pandemic, I think, has taught all of us is having gratitude for one another, for this precious gift of life, is something really just to hold inside of ourselves and then bring out into the world. And in our field, in child and adolescent mental health, we are helping support the growth of the future generations. It's really, really sacred work. And I want to thank you for all the hard work you're doing. And I look forward to future conversations.
Take good care.
Thank you. You too. Be well.